This morning we return to the book of Matthew, Matthew chapter 2, and we will be building a little bit on our study from last week. We spent a lot of time last week talking about the wise men and introducing who they were and some details about them, and we found that these are noblemen from Persia that have come. They were kingmakers, the Magi. They were in other multiple cultures along the way. And they went and they would pronounce the arrival of a new king. And they would greet them. And so how incredible it is that Matthew, we see that in Matthew's gospel, of these kingmakers that arrive to pronounce a new king here. They were aware of the birthplace and the anticipation of a birth of the Messiah, because as we studied last week, back when Daniel was taken into Babylon and was placed there, he shared with them, those Magi then in Babylon, hundreds of years before the birth of Christ, about this promised Messiah, and he gave them the prophecies and everything that would lead up to this. And so as passed through generations of that, when they saw that supernatural sign, that light in the sky that told them it was time. They knew the prophecy was coming, and so they headed toward Jerusalem. And so we saw that. We talked about the fact that they probably rode horses. That was for the Persians and the Arabians. It was probably horses and not camels at the time, but that's okay. Send your Christmas cards and have your place, and it's fine. But we can know a little bit about them and where they came from, and how all of that kind of fit together. And we saw the great irony that the Jewish people, who should have been looking for the arrival of their Messiah, who knew prophecies that said that Messiah would be born in Bethlehem, knew those things, they didn't even really bother with the Christ child. And yet these Gentile noblemen came 1,000 miles to see this newborn king. And so what an incredible thing. We see that the leaders and rulers and theologians and the priests of Israel were totally indifferent to the birth of Christ. One of the things that we took note of last week, King Herod, he was bitter and he was angry that there would be a king of the Jews being declared. So we saw that. So we have an interesting contrast in reactions to the people of the birth of Christ. And there are those that are antagonistic toward Christ. There are people who are just indifferent, really, to Christ. And then there are people who are coming, seeking Him, to worship Him. And so we'll see more of that as we move forward. Actually, in this passage, we'll think about a 5-act play, if you will. There's the arrival, and then an agitation, the acting, the adoration, and then the avoidance. And we'll see that in this passage, beginning Matthew chapter 2. It says, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem, Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star in the east, and we have come to worship him. When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. When he had called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Christ was to be born. In Bethlehem, in Judea, they replied, for this is what the prophet has written. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For out of you will come a ruler who will be the shepherd of my people Israel. Then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, go and make a careful search for the child. And as soon as you find him, report to me so that I too may go and worship him. After they had heard the king, they went out on their way, and the star they had seen in the east went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold and of frankincense and of myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route. So first thing we see here, the first act is the arrival. We saw that last week, that shortly after Jesus' birth, Magi arrived in Jerusalem. And there's two things to note. The first, it says in Bethlehem in Judea. Well, Bethlehem is a quiet little town. And about 5 or 6 miles outside of Jerusalem. Quiet little place. And interesting, in the Old Testament, we know that the same city was the same name, but it's Ephrathah that it's called. Also, or Bethlehem. That word literally means house of bread. And what an interesting thing that the bread of life would be born in a town that is named that. Bethlehem has a long history in the Old Testament. We see it. Remember Rachel, that Jacob buried Rachel in Bethlehem, Scripture tells us, and he put up a marker. And today, if you go there, they'll still show you the marker, a marker, and say, this is where Rachel was buried. Well, Jacob buried Rachel so long ago, and Ruth married Boaz in the book of Ruth, and they lived in Bethlehem. But of course, above all those other stories, we know of the one that came from Bethlehem, a guy by the name of David, and King David. And they said and we talk about the city of David, and we're talking about Bethlehem and where he comes from at that point, and the Messiah would be born and come from that place. We're told about that. Another note about the arrival of the wise men, sometimes passed, by the way, since the birth of Christ. We see down in verse 11, it says, on coming to the house, right? Coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshiped him. And I know I'm messing up some more Christmas cards here, but the wise men did not go to the manger. It was a little time. There's a period for the Jewish tradition was that after giving birth, there was a 40-day cleansing period for the woman before she was publicly out in public. And so chances are that it's been at least 40 days. They're in a house now. They're not there, but they came in Bethlehem to see the child. And another note of interest says during the time of Herod. We talked about Herod was a king that was installed by Rome. Rome ruled over that area, but they needed somebody to be in charge of making sure that there was peace in the streets and that the taxes were collected. That was the two things. And if you could do that, by golly, they'd make you king over an area. And that's where it comes from in that. And so the Romans needed a guy to handle actually Jerusalem and Judea, and they put a king, Antipas was his name, that was over that. Herod was given the surrounding area, and so that would include Nazareth, okay, and some things. So that comes into play in part of Nazareth and Bethlehem, that would be the area around the place. So we see that. These Gentile kingmakers have come. They've seen this miraculous sign in the sky. And so that's the arrival, and we see the agitation then. After that, Herod hears about this. They guys come in, and they probably don't know a lot about Herod. They didn't know that he's got a fiery temper, that he was super jealous. And they said, where? They come and they arrive and they go to meet the king, and they say, where's the one who's been born king of the Jews? That didn't sit well with Herod. It says he was disturbed in all of Jerusalem with him. Why all Jerusalem with him? Talked a little bit about Herod, right? He was a horrible guy when it came to relationships. He'd killed his own sons, his son-in-law, one of his wives, others. Anytime he thought there was a threat to his throne, he was jealous, and he would respond. And he's calling himself King of the Jews, and they come in and say, well, where's the one born King of the Jews? What do you mean? That's my title. And so that sets him off. The agitation that we see there in that. no one, by the way, from an administrative standpoint, Herod wasn't just bad at everything. He was just bad in relationships and his jealousy things. He was a good builder. He was a good military leader. He built great things. In that time, the fortress at Masada, Herod built that. We've heard about Herod's temple, the great temple he built, and it was the temple that Jesus would have been at. In the things we read in Jerusalem and some things before it was destroyed in 70 A.D., he built a great amphitheater, the hippodrome, racetrack, the chariot races. You think Ben-Hur and stuff. Herod built those things, so he could do some great things from that end of it. But just don't cross him. That was the problem. So we talked about the Magi and about Herod. Magi's coming to worship, seeking to worship, and Herod reacting in anger and bitterness. So Herod needs to do something. He hears about this, and so verse 4 says, he called together the people's chief priests and teachers of the law and asked them about this Messiah. Folks, this is something Herod should have known, first of all. It was in the prophecies. It was in the prophecies of the Messiah and where he would be born. And they tell him that. They said, well, it's in Bethlehem. But he calls out, he has them, and who are these people that he brings in? Well, all of these different priests. We'll give you just a little background about the priests and the scribes. We hear that all the time in the New Testament. We talk about the high priest and the chief priests and the scribes and the Pharisees. And, well, of course, the high priest, he was the guy that once a year would go into the Holy of Holies and make the sacrifice. He was the one person, one time a year, that would go in to make the sacrifice for the people into the Holy of Holies at the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. That was the day that they would go in and do that. And so that's the high priest. There was supposed to be one high priest, and over the generations from the law of Moses until now, they've begun to elect different high priests. And so there's a lot of guys running around that have been high priests. They were supposed to be that until they died. But so they've kind of they've changed that up a little bit. Then there's another kind of priest, the captain of the temple. He was appointed by the high priest, and he was in charge of the temple guard. He could have people arrested and do things with that. And then there's the chief priest. It's a group of overseers that saw over everything in the temple, from collecting of the offerings and all the different things that would go on. And these guys make up the Sanhedrin, the 70, that ruling council in Jerusalem. And then there's some ordinary priests. These guys that would go, they were bivocational guys. They would do their own stuff, but 2 weeks out of the year they served as a priest in the temple. So we have this big group, and Herod is calling in all of these guys going, tell me about this prophecy and tell me what's going on. In verse 4 they see that, and they tell him that he's supposed to be born in Bethlehem, and they know that. Now, isn't that amazing? Think about this. There's been a little bit of time pass. When the wise men get there, we know it's been a few days, at least a couple of weeks, at least since the baby's born. What did the shepherds do? Well, we sing about the shepherd. They went in, they saw him that night, and it said then they went out praising God and telling people about all they had seen and heard. So for at least a few weeks, they've been hearing these stories around Bethlehem, around Jerusalem, about this star and the angel that came, and the shepherds and this incredible, all this stuff we've seen. And the Jews are like, man, why wasn't there a line of people? Why weren't there people getting to see that, right? To come and see this Messiah that had been prophesied. They were so wrapped up in their self-absorbed things, and God didn't check with the high priest and tell him it was going to be time for Messiah, whatever they thought was going on. They were indifferent to that. Wouldn't it have been worth checking out if you'd had a prophecy from Daniel from hundreds of years ago that said that the Messiah was going to be born at this time in this place, and the shepherds are telling this story? Wouldn't you go see? But no, I mean, those are shepherds. First of all, they discounted them. Everything they didn't respond to that. in that. So we see that lack of response in toward the Christ child, and so we have the anger of Herod, they have the indifference of the priest, and we have the wise men who've come to worship him. We really see that still in today's world. We have people that don't want Jesus intruding into their life. They don't want to have anybody judging their decisions in life and what they do in life. They're antagonistic toward that. I don't need that. I don't want that. I don't have it. I don't care. And they are adamantly opposed. That continued there. 33 years later, they killed Jesus in that, and people still feel that way today, some people. In the second category, the indifference, there's still people that are that way today. They may not openly criticize the church or Christ or Christians in the way of life, but also they don't think twice about it. Sunday is just another day, a day on the weekend for them to sleep in, catch up, do whatever they want. They don't think twice about it through their days, through their week they're just indifferent to it. Sometimes you probably have heard people talk about movies or TV shows or something that you've never seen, and you're like, yeah, well, whatever, right? I don't know anything about that. And there's people that want to live their life that way, completely indifferent to Jesus. You do what you do, as long as it doesn't interfere with anything with me, I'm okay. And they kind of live that way in their own self-absorbed world. And then there's that third category, the Magi, those seeking him to worship him. That makes a difference, that recognizes who Jesus is in that third category. And so that's kind of who's involved here. Let's get back then to in verse 7, we see the next act, the acting. In verses 7 and 8, it says, when Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared, he sent them to Bethlehem and said, go and search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me so that I too may go and worship him. Why do I title this section the acting? Because that is the act of the biggest hypocrisy ever. When Herod says that, he's not one to go worship Christ's child. He wants to kill him. He wants to get rid of him. They've got a threat to the throne. And so that is reaction. Notice he calls them and says here secretly. They first met him publicly. I need to ask these guys more questions, but I don't want to stir up rumors around town. So this is a secret meeting. He calls them secretly and says, okay, tell me again, and tell me exactly when you saw this star. I need a timeline, guys, so I can find this guy. And that's what he's after. And then he lies to them and tells them, but let me know as soon as you know so I can go worship him too. And so that's the acting that we see in that. Herod is the fool of fools. I mean, there's instead of falling at Jesus' feet, instead of even when his own scribes and Pharisees says, the Messiah is going to be born in Bethlehem. This could be what they're talking about. Instead of saying, I need to find out and check this out. This could be, instead, he's agitated and angry and wants to kill him in that. And so then we find in Act 4, the adoration, verse 11, it says that the wise men, on coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and they worshiped him. And they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Like I said, they're not in a stable anymore. They're in a manger. They're in a house. The baby's a few weeks, a couple months old, whatever. We don't know exactly. By the way, whenever Mary and the baby are mentioned here, the baby is always mentioned first. The priority is on the child here, the Christ, the King. That's here in verse 11, verse 13, verse 14 here. We see verse 20, verse 21, all through here. Matthew refers to him. It's always the child and his mother. The child first. And that's the priority in that. But it says the wise men came and they bowed down and they worshipped him. Not them. They worshipped him. The baby, the child, that was that. And they honored him as a king. This was God, and this was King that they worshipped, and they honored him by giving him these gifts. Well, the gifts, gold is obvious, the great value of gold. We know about that, right? It's the nicest stuff. And frankincense is a pure incense, puts off a fragrant scent. It's used in the sacrificial offerings to be that incense that would rise to heaven, that would be pleasing to God. That aroma, it's valuable and great incense. And then, of course, the myrrh is a precious ointment and a perfume. But there's a significance way beyond the natural use of each of those gifts. And a couple different things. One that you may not think about, Mary and Joseph have gone up to get registered for this tax. They have a baby, right? They don't know it at the time they go, but God knows that Herod's going to fly off the handle and try to kill all these babies, all the children, male children under the age of 2, right? And so God knows that Mary and Joseph, they're not going back to Nazareth and Joseph going back to work in a carpenter shop. They're going to flee for their lives and go live in a foreign land. How are they going to afford to do that? How are they going to do those things? They go there and they stay a while and then they have to come back and their lives have been uprooted. One of the practical things, God doesn't forget the practical things that we need in our life. He knows you need to eat. He knows, that we need clothes and we need heat and some things like that. Those super valuable gifts could have been the way that they were able to sustain themselves during that time. I don't know if you've ever thought about that, but what an incredible thing that God even would meet those needs for them in giving them things that they could sell and be able to live during that time. But even a step further, gold is a gift. Not only is it a precious thing, but it's a gift for a king. Joseph, when he was in Egypt, the vice regent next to the king, it says they give him a golden chain. Daniel was given gold as he stood next to the king in Babylon. Kings in the Bible and crowns in gold, and we see all the scepters of gold. We see all those descriptions. Solomon, everything about Solomon. It was just to go through and read. It was stuff of gold. Gold was a gift for a king, signifying Jesus is the king. Don't miss that. Frankincense speaks of deity. Like I said, it was used in the sacrifices. It was a gift for God. It was meant that it was used in that way. Exodus 30 says that incense is the gift for God, not for the people, but for God. And so we see a gift for a king, and we see a gift for God that's given to Jesus. And then the myrrh is a gift for a mortal. The myrrh is a perfume that made life a little more tolerable for him. It was used in preparation for a body when it died, so that the smell wouldn't be so bad. It was a gift for a man, a mortal, a human being. And so we see that in those three gifts: a gift for a king, a gift for God, and a gift for a man, because Jesus is all three in that in the same time. So what an incredible picture that we see this. And then in the final act we see the avoidance in verse 12. It says, the wise men, having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route. These are Gentiles. These guys, what they know about this God and things are stuff that's been handed down to them from generations of Daniel being in Babylon, and telling the other magi that have handed it down through that time. They're Gentiles. It doesn't show any other record of them following God, following the laws of Moses, doing any kind of thing like that. But they know that this is going to be a significant event. And then they've seen this great star. They've seen all of these other signs fall together. And they go, these guys, God comes to them. An angel, doesn't tell us whether an angel came to them. Exactly what it says. It just says, having been warned in a dream. I don't know if all of them had the dream. One of them had the dream. Remember, we don't really know how many there are. There's always 3 in the Christmas play, but the Bible doesn't say there's 3. But a God that they really don't know impresses upon them, don't go back to Herod. Don't do that. That'll be bad. and they listen. And they go another route to return home. What an incredible thing. What an interesting contrast between the peace and the wonder in the hearts of the Magi as they come to worship a newborn king. And the panic and the hatred and the jealousy of King Herod. There's wise men and there's fools. The wise men seeking after Christ, and Herod's the fool who wants to fight against him. And that still present today. The wise men and the fools and those in between that are indifferent. I don't know where you're at in that this morning. Are you antagonistic and bitter toward God, toward Jesus, toward that Christ child? Interfering with your life, your world, or, are you just indifferent? Or are you truly seeking to worship Christ? Do you see Him as King? Do you see Him as God? And do you see Him as the man, the incarnate Savior that gave His life? Don't miss any of that in the Christmas season. Oh, it's a little baby born. Yeah. And the little babies are adorable and we love them. And it's hard to wrap our mind around the fact that He's also God, that He's a King, and that He's going to give His life for you and me. What an incredible thing that God unfolds for us. Don't miss the significance of the baby that came that night in Bethlehem so long ago. Father God, what an incredible